Well, I'm a lawyer here in Washington State. I'm 48 years old. I was educated at UCLA and Cambridge. Currently, I'm maintaining a truth campaign in two areas that I want the United States government to confront and disclose critical information to us about. The first is the fact that Mars is an inhabited planet. That fact was proved to a reasonable certainty back in 2008. I spent about 1,000 hours analyzing NASA image 10214, which is a western view of the western reaches of the West Valley of the Columbia Basin of the Gusev crater of Mars. And that photograph is really abundant with details that show humanoid life, different animal species, and very fascinating ancient artifacts on the surface of Mars. I summarized those findings in a landmark paper entitled The Discovery of Life on Mars, which I published in late 2008. And at that time I founded the Mars Anomaly Research Society, or MARS, to research, disclose, and educate the public about the fact that Mars has an indigenous ecosystem and an indigenous civilization. We can prove that with the kind of natural history research into the images that are now coming back from NASA, and the rovers are now scouring the surface of the red planet and providing some very interesting data that I maintain shows that Mars is an inhabited planet. There's a growing body of literature that I'm also contributing to in the realm of deep politics that involves the 40-year cover-up of the space agency's knowledge that Mars is inhabited, liaison programs that have been underway since around 1970 between Martian astronauts who have come to our planet, and also the existence of a secret space program that I was a participant in that has been placing individuals on Mars. So there's really a natural history prong and then also a deep political prong of that particular component of my truth campaign within the disclosure movement.
Well, Andy, that is amazing.
Right. And so that's the first half of it, and those findings we're placing at the Annals of Mars at our website, which is www.projectmars.net. In fact, I'm writing up about 50 more major findings, so hopefully by the end of the year there will be about 100 research papers at the Annals of Mars, at our website, projectmars.net, that people can make their own conclusions, but we believe that we've already published clear, convincing, and compelling evidence that Mars is inhabited. So even if you don't want to believe the claims of whistleblowers regarding the existence of the secret space program and the Mars cover-up by the United States government, you can at least now have the opportunity to view the data and make your own conclusions about what it shows. I know that it will ultimately be established to a societal certainty that Mars, in fact, is inhabited. So I'm just sort of enjoying the process of now studying NASA's photographs, sort of doing the cosmic footwork, because I believe that ultimately my case that Mars is inhabited will be proved and become the societal consensus. The other component of my truth campaign involves an extensive series of experiences I had as a child in Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. There I'm simply sharing an account of my childhood experiences as one of the child participants in the classified defense-related research and development program that the U.S. government had underway, which by 1970 had already mastered essentially access to past and future events by either sending somebody there via Tesla-based teleportation or generating images of a non-local event with devices called chronovisors. So my purpose there is simply to share my experiences so that the American public and the people of the world know that time travel has already emerged. In fact, quantum access, which encompasses a variety of different forms of time travel, both physical and virtual, is already affecting the political governance of the United States and hence the world. And so I'm speaking out as a former project participant because I need that as we confront the fact that we're going to be going from 6 billion to 9 billion human beings on this planet by the year 2045, we're going to have to create a new technical infrastructure on planet Earth. And I believe a major component of that is going to be teleportation. At a minimum, to move goods via teleportation, but ultimately to move human beings, initially probably between major cities that we would fly commercial airliners between. But I believe that's not only going to be favorable, I believe it's going to be necessary to achieve planetary sustainability. So I believe it's my moral duty to now speak out and articulate what I know about the U.S. government's involvement in time travel for the last 40 years and what its implications are. So that in a nutshell is the thrust of my truth campaign as an individual active in the disclosure movement.
Okay, well, Andy, I appreciate you putting yourself on the line and coming out and sharing this information with everybody, because I as well feel it's very important. So, Andy, what happened to you as a child, and how did you get involved in this?
Boy, that's really a murky question. You know, I've spent 10 years investigating my experiences in Project Pegasus, now going on 12 years. I began back in the late 90s, just writing down what I could remember about what happened, and then doing internet research, contacting people who were involved, making major fact-finding trips to New Mexico. Essentially, at age 6, my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, who was an electrical engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, took me from our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, up to the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, which was it was a location where there were different numbered buildings where different classified defense projects were ongoing. And in Building 68 at Curtiss-Wright, there was a room about twice the size of a high school classroom. And in the front of the room, standing on the ground, were two elliptical-shaped objects. By elliptical, I mean they were sort of parentheses-shaped, but they were sort of standing freely on their own base, sort of like stereo speakers. And between those two armatures, as they were called, radiated a field of energy that Tesla discovered and then figured out a way to harness to bend the fabric of time-space. He called it radiant energy. Radiant energy in that kind of array kind of looks like water falling and shimmering, let's say in a public fountain where you have a water sculpture. But if you move up to, let's say, about a foot away, it looks very much like raster on a TV set. And my father explained how we were going to jump through that field of shimmering light and for a short period of time find ourselves in a kind of tunnel. And then we would arrive on a hillside somewhere else in the country. Well, we did so, and I found myself moving forward through this tunnel. What the teleporter does is it opens up a vortal tunnel in the time-space continuum. So really, if you apply the theory of relativity, you're jumping through a hole in time-space, but simultaneously the universe is being wrapped around you and past you. And several seconds later, the tunnel closed. You know, we saw a pinprick of light, and then the tunnel closed. I mean, the light came towards us very rapidly. The tunnel closed, and we were in the state capitol complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And over the next 5 years, I would jump back and forth that way between New Jersey and New Mexico. We would come back to New Jersey through an identical lab and an identical device that was at the Sandia National Labs in Sandia, New Mexico, adjacent to the Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque. And in that first meeting, my father then drove from Santa Fe over to the Los Alamos National Labs, where we met with Dr. Harold M. Agnew, who was one of the Manhattan Project physicists. He was then the director of the W Division, or the Weapons Division, of the Los Alamos National Laboratories. And he, in fact, was the only individual who had been a participant in all three critical stages of the Manhattan Project. He had been in the squash courts at the University of Chicago when the atomic pile went critical. He was in Los Alamos and Alamogordo when the atomic bomb was designed and tested. And he even monitored the Hiroshima blast from a plane that was falling behind the Enola Gay that was called the Great Artiste. So Agnew was a principal insider and a prominent physicist within the Los Alamos physics community. It was to that community that Nikola Tesla's papers were directed by the War Department when they were seized upon his death in January of 1943. So in the intervening 25 years, the Defense Department had been experimenting with the different designs that were found in Tesla's papers, and it was accidentally discovered that this particular device was a teleporter. And it was during that meeting with Dr. Agnew that he asked my father whether we had gotten from the East Coast to New Mexico via the teleporter, as he put it. And my father said yes. And then my father asked Dr. Agnew, have you tried it yet? In other words, have you teleported yet with this new technology? And Dr. Agnew's response was, no, but I want to. Now, it was during that conversation that Dr. Agnew asked my father my age when he looked over at me, and we both said simultaneously 6. So we can date that first teleportation experience that I had between New Jersey and New Mexico as having occurred sometime between September of 1967 and September of 1968, because I had been born in September of 1961. And so I think that meeting was of historical significance, not only because now as a whistleblower, I can affirm the fact that the U.S. government has achieved teleportation, but that allows us to date the emergence of that technology within the secret realm of the defense community. Mm-hmm. And then beginning in fall of 1969, I was placed in an actual program. It was a structured educational program where they were preparing a cadre of 140 American school children to essentially be our first group of chrononauts when we reached adulthood. And they were acclimating us to different forms of quantum access using different devices. There are different ways to both travel to a past or future event or gather intelligence information about it without going there. And so for those 3 years, from fall of 69 to spring, summer of 1972, I was exposed essentially to the secret time travel technologies of the U.S. government that I'm now articulating for the public as a whistleblower.
Okay, and has this done anything negative towards your career, coming out with this information?
No, actually my career is booming. It hasn't
Great.
affected my legal career. I think because, you know, we tend to disparage lawyers, but from my experience now, having practiced law for 14 years, the legal profession is full of a lot of good people and a lot of intelligent people. And after some of my colleagues in the law realize that I'm stepping forward to lead a major political crusade, I think they've actually admired me. And I mean, they've expressed their support for my work in this area. I mean, if you've had any involvement with the U.S. government as an attorney, you realize that it's a huge enterprise full of all different types of things going on, many of which are not known to the rest of the government. And so because I'm positioning my campaign not as a science fiction tale, you know, not as a science fiction fantasy, but as science fact, and I'm not really dwelling on the science as if I would be making claims to being a physicist, but really focusing on the historical and political cover-up and fighting a government that has maintained secrecy over literally dozens of major advances over the last 60 years since the Manhattan Project. I've actually had many words of encouragement from my peers in the law, and the private practice of law that I maintain is actually burgeoning as I meet more people and maintain my truth campaign as an ancillary activity to my professional practices. So no, it hasn't hurt my career at all, and I think that lawyers understand that if we're going to create what the 21st century is going to become, which could be, for example, I believe it will be a society where, for example, you could go to Grand Central Teleport in New York City and jump through a teleporter and reach Union Teleport in Los Angeles in several seconds. I think lawyers among professionals in the United States are curious about what the future is going to hold. They're concerned that our population pressures and the crisis of environment and development is going to require solutions, not just hand-wringing about climate change, but real solutions. And that this country, among all countries, is most capable of galvanizing itself into a period of creativity where we address the needs of our global society. That I really think that there's a strong support in the legal community for my truth campaign, and it really hasn't hurt my professional practice at all.
Well, that's great, and I'm glad to hear that because, I just wish more people would work this hard to get the truth out because, again, it is important, and, they cover up so much, and to hear this story is fascinating to me. So then you're telling me that we actually have the ability to teleport, say, like Star Trek or Sliders. Is it anything like that?
No, in fact, the form of teleportation that emerged in Star Trek when it first appeared on American television in 1966 was the opposite of the teleportation that around that time was actually emerging in the U.S. defense technical community. In Star Trek, somebody is essentially digitized. They stand in an energy field, and their molecules are disintegrated and somehow in a way that's coherent, and then they're reintegrated at their destination. That can't work because it would kill a living organism by disaggregating its molecules. So cellular metabolism would stop in the same way that it stops when somebody is blown up.
So you might get there, but you might get there dead.
Well, you'd get there, and you'd get there in a lot of lifeless little pieces. You basically would lose your life in the process of being disaggregated. And therefore, the opposite is actually what emerged around 1966-67 when Star Trek debuted on American television. It basically involves a situation where the device creates a disequilibrium in the fabric of time-space and essentially opens up a tunnel that you then pass through uninjured, at least most of the time. There was one mishap when I was serving on the project where, sadly, one of the children my age, a young boy, lost his feet because when he arrived in Santa Fe, he was standing in about 3 inches of water in a public fountain that had been leaking. And as a result, his feet arrived slightly later, and he slid off his feet at the ankles. So this was a dangerous and experimental technology. Those of us who were serving in it were serving in it at the risk of our life and limb. We were doing it in furtherance of the defense needs of the United States and its allies. And that's another reason I'm speaking out, because we made a contribution to the defense effort of our country that I'm certainly proud of, and that now the true story needs to be told so that we can liberate this technology from where it's secretly held in the U.S. defense community and use it to advantage life all over the world.
Andy, why did they use children?
Well, there were a number of reasons, and I gathered those both from things that were in our educational program that were explained to us, things I overheard incidentally, and then as a result of a series of heart-to-heart discussions I had with my dad before his death in 1990. Essentially, we were clearly experimentees. So the first reason that they were using kids is because they needed to test the cognitive and physiological impacts of teleportation on children. If, for example, the President of the United States was in a conference in London and then needed to get to Sydney, Australia, which is 24 hours by air, in a time-urgent way, they were hoping that they could establish a hub of teleports around the world and be teleporting the President. Now, if the President and other executive branch officials, military officials, members of the intelligence community, the diplomatic corps, were teleporting between different world cities, there were clearly going to be times when their children were going to be going with them. And so they needed to develop baseline data on the impact of teleportation on the mental and physical functioning of bright, healthy children from stable families. We were, in fact, the third cadre of teleportees that Project Pegasus had been working with. The first were a group of Navy enlisted men, young men, who unfortunately the first 3 lost their lives jumping through the teleporter because the tunnel was too long and they ended up asphyxiating as a result of not having enough oxygen that was left after they pushed a few breathfuls of oxygen when they jumped into the vortal tunnel through the device. My father explained in the late 80s how the second cadre were a group of underprivileged children from Latin America. Our government had entered a set of Faustian arrangements with some of the right-wing authoritarian governments of Latin America, and we were actually bringing Latin American school children up and involving them in these black defense projects. And that was just to test whether children would survive. then they wanted to see, okay, well, now that we found that children can survive this, let's see what the impact mentally and physically is on a kid who is fortunate enough to be privileged, to have a roof over his head, to be fed, and to be educated and loved and so forth. And so I was one of those privileged kids in the sense that I was growing up in the United States in a loving family, in a country with enough shelter, enough food supply, education, health care. And so they brought together 140 of us from that kind of background, sort of a typical middle-class American background. And after we would jump through the device, every time we arrived in Santa Fe, they were then busing us to an old school site up in Lamy, New Mexico. And there we would be medically examined. They would test our heart rate, our blood pressure, and so forth, and our temperature. And then we would sit down and take about 2 hours of standardized testing to see what it was doing to our mental processes. So the first reason is that we were essentially experimentees. They wanted to develop baseline data on the effects of teleportation on children. The second reason is that one of the devices in particular required small, intelligent, cooperative children. And by that I mean that the holograms that were being propagated by the electro-optical devices called chronovisors. These are the devices that essentially have a lensing effect. A crystal array made of bismuth is used to bend images of events that are going on non-locally in the quantum hologram, and what we would call the past and future, are brought into the laboratory. And those holograms were very fragile when the chronovisors were first developed by Project Pegasus. If, for example, an adult stood in the hologram, it was very likely that the hologram would start sort of quaking and then blink out like an early picture image, TV, a picture, TV tube image. And so they needed small children who would have less of an effect on the stability of the hologram, less of respiration, a quieter heartbeat, less intense blood pressure, and a quieter footfall and so forth. So even, for example, if somebody coughed in the laboratory, sometimes the hologram would be affected by that. So they realized they were going to have to use small people to be able to travel within the hologram to see what was there in that past or future event that was being brought into the laboratory and allowing for kind of virtual time travel. I call it physio-virtual because there were some paradoxes where there were elements of actual experience in the hologram, but I'm going to describe that in my book. It would be too lengthy to describe that tonight, but it was more than just a virtual reality, that we were in some ways actually there physically as a result of being in the hologram.
Okay, how did they...
Reason,
go ahead.
I was going to say, Mike, the third reason is that they told us that, they explained how the perceptions of children are very keen. Children see things as they are because their perceptions are not influenced by the selection bias of their existing experiences, of their memories. Children don't tend to superimpose their beliefs over their findings. They make findings based on their five senses, and then they begin establishing beliefs about what the nature of reality is. And so they explained how we were basically blank slates. We were tabula rasa, and they needed to use us as observers in the program. And I was going to say the fourth reason is that they explained to us how some of us would go on to the Naval Academy and then be placed in a secret time-space exploration program that would be fully fledged when we were grown-ups. In other words, we were being trained as cadets, if you will, in what ultimately would become a time-space program to rival the space program. So those were the four basic purposes, four basic reasons they were using children.
Now, how did they get somebody exactly where they wanted them? How did they coordinate that to...
Well, with the teleport, I don't know. I know there was a man operating a kind of rudimentary keyboard and rudimentary computer screen sitting in a chair over on the left side of the left armature of the device. So he clearly was setting the length of the Vortal tunnel that was created by the field of energy. I don't know how that was done. I do know that by the fall of 1970, after we had extensive experience jumping back and forth across the country this way in the summer of 1970, that they had also developed the ability to set the device so that they could set you forward and backward in time, at least within the time envelope of the existence of the program at that point. Because one of the limitations to teleportation is you don't want to send somebody to a time before the existence of the teleportation system because you will strand them at that location in time-space. So I don't know how they were setting the teleporter. In the case of the chronovisors, there were two men operating these devices that looked like closed-circuit TV cameras. My father called them boom operators, and they were directing an emission of some kind of particle across the hologram to set the time-space coordinate of the particular image that was being brought into view by the chronovisor. In other words, the chronovisor was able to capture the signal of a past event or future event and then amplify it and broadcast it in the laboratory. And so I know that those boom operators were directing some form of energy across the hologram. I suspect it may have been maybe a positron emission against a field of neutrinos, something like that. There was some sort of atomic interaction that was occurring that enabled them not just to set up a hologram of a past or future event at random, but actually tune in a specific time and place, and hence what was going on at that location. And so I was privileged to see a number of historical events when I was serving on the project. For example, the signing of the U.S. Constitution, the crucifixion of Jesus. I mean, they were able to isolate particular locations and then hunt around to see if the historical data of what time it occurred was accurate, and then maybe do a little bit of exploration if there was any discrepancy, and then actually tune in particular past events with specificity.
Did they ever lose anybody? I mean, I know that you said some would come with feet missing and things of that nature, but did they ever lose anybody?
Well, one boy lost his feet teleporting. When we were being trained on the chronovisor at Morristown, one of the team leaders who was training us, who was Jack Pruitt, who would go on to serve as the research director for the Montauk Project, explained that one of the girls had been rendered blind as a result of looking up at the intense light being generated by the crystal array that propagated the hologram inside the chronovisor. I was later told in the late 90s, early 10s, by a CIA agent who they placed in my life sort of as a contact officer. He was providing different information to me about government operations and different things the government was working on, and ultimately ended up involving me in several teleportings to Mars. I asked Courtney Hunt one time whether they had ever, that the program had ever lost anybody teleporting, and he said yes. But those events didn't occur at any time that I was in the program. In other words, I didn't witness anybody being lost, and I didn't hear about anybody being lost via teleportation when I was serving on the project as a young child. But then, you know, in my late 30s and after, when I was consulting with Mr. Hunt about my experiences in Project Pegasus, to include other things, he explained that they had, in fact, lost people in time. And I might add that when we were being trained on the teleportation in the summer of 1970, Jack Pruitt explained that the reason they were using the particular area of New Jersey where that teleport was located, which had been inhabited for centuries by the Lenape Indians, and the reason they also selected Santa Fe, which had been long settled by the Spanish. The New Mexico Territory had been in existence for 400 years before New Mexico statehood. The reason that they were selecting these two ancient locations in the United States as the principal teleports is because if we were lost in time as children, there would be settlements there that we could find adoptive parents in. They basically trained us to go to the most responsible adults we could find in whatever community we found ourselves in, and explain that our parents had been killed and we were orphans and that we would like to be adopted into their household. So they clearly were contingency planning for the possibility that we might be displaced in time-space and not and in an irretrievable way. But I didn't have any contact with that kind of experience when I was serving in the program as a child, and I doubt it probably would have been shared with us if something like that did happen.
So they wanted you as a child so they could develop you as an adult. Jumping ahead a little bit here, how did you actually get out of it, knowing what you know?
Well, in the late spring of 1972, a meeting was held, and it was explained that now was going to happen what happens to all participants in classified defense-related research and development programs, which is we were going to be dismissed from the project. The project was going to keep no permanent records of our participation, at least those that would ever be publicly available. And if anybody ever approached the government about our involvement, that person would be told that the project never existed and they didn't know who we were. So we were basically told that we were going to be deep-sixed from the project and basically shoved off deck like surplus military equipment. And that's what happened. But then the strange thing is that there was another experience in New Mexico that summer. So that was sort of where they summarily dismissed most of the kids in the project, and then they retained a few of us for some follow-on activities in the summer of 1972. And then after that, I was basically let go from the project and had a pretty ordinary adolescence in Southern California and attended junior high, high school, and college at UCLA in Los Angeles and had very little contact with the project except for an occasional interview by one of my teachers in school about my memories of what had happened, or perhaps a Navy officer. So periodically I would be reminded of my involvement in the project. I would say something to one of my friends at school about it. But really after around age 12 there, actually 11, because we moved to California in November of 72 when I was 11. So at that point, I believed that my experiences were over. I tried to write down everything that had happened, and when we were moving from our home in New Jersey to relocate to Los Angeles in 1972, my father found a little book where I was detailing everything that had happened in the project, which was really my first attempt to write my book about my experiences. And he again admonished me to keep no written record of what had happened. And he actually ripped up that notepad and flushed it down the toilet. So at that point, I just had a strange set of memories, and because when I attempted to explain what had happened to my brothers or sisters or my friends in the neighborhood or at school, and naturally and understandably they would have such a sense of incredulity about the reality of what I was talking about, I found that I really had no one to talk about except my father regarding what he had permitted me to be involved in. And so it took until my mid-30s to even start revisiting what had happened and to make an attempt to memorialize what had happened in writing and share my experiences with others. And so really my memories were sort of just in the back of my mind for 20 or 30 years there before I even seriously went about the business of revisiting them so that I could share them with others.
Okay, Andy, are there any scientists or anybody in government from that project who may still be in government or involved in that project today?
Yes, actually, one of them recently ran for president, and that's Governor Bill Richardson. I allege, and it's the truth, that a young Bill Richardson served on Project Pegasus. Specifically what he was doing was when we first began teleporting to Santa Fe from New Jersey as a group of children. This was several years after I'd first teleported with my father, but when they actually began actively educating us in a specialized learning program to be involved in such an advanced and esoteric set of technical activities, they were acclimating us to the experience of teleporting. So we had many runs between Woodridge, New Jersey and Santa Fe, New Mexico. When we would arrive in New Mexico, the young man that was taking roll, you just mentioned the danger of being lost in time. The young man who was taking roll and taking us inside and asking us our name first and last and having us spell our last names and give our date of birth was a young Bill Richardson, who would go on to serve as the congressman from the 3rd District of New Mexico, where the atomic research labs are located. He would then serve as Energy Secretary for President Clinton, as our representative to the UN, and then ultimately as governor of New Mexico, and most recently ran for president of the United States in 2008. Bill Richardson is the only public servant who was attached to Project Pegasus who honored my service by meeting with me personally, although secretly, to discuss my experiences. I had a brief colloquy with Bill Richardson in June of 2003 in Chama, New Mexico, that was arranged by an historian, a friend of mine, who had contacts not with his office, but with the CIA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. And Governor Richardson explained that I had to appreciate that he was governor of a state, and he couldn't just hold a press conference and announce that 40 years previous, or at that point, 35 years previously, he had been a 25-year-old serving on the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence. But he said, I appreciate your investigation. I think if I was in your position as one of the children on the project, I would be doing the same thing, but you just have to understand that I can't help you. And so I think that was a really decent and principled position to take, and it was really neat for me to reach back and interact with him so many years after I had first met him as one of the children in the project. Actually, he has a great sense of humor. I said to him, you know, Governor, you've certainly put a lot of weight on your resume since you were a young staffer on the project and I was one of the children. And he said, not just on my resume. And he talked to me for a while there, kind of in a sidebar discussion. There was an antique car show in Chama that day, and we were just sort of standing over beside these exquisite vintage cars and talking about the U.S. time travel projects of 35 years previously. So he served, and I'm going to be calling on him publicly. During the July 4th weekend, I'm going to be issuing a public call for Governor Richardson and several of the other participants to step forward and acknowledge the truth of what I'm describing. The other major figure who had much larger of a role in Project Pegasus was former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld served as the defense attaché to Project Pegasus. He had previously served as a congressman from Illinois. He had been a Navy pilot who was decorated for his service during the Korean War. And he had an ongoing relationship with the U.S. Defense Department as a result of his naval career and his congressional career long before he was named Defense Secretary the first time by President Ford and then later by President George W. Bush. Don Rumsfeld was somebody that my father and I interacted with extensively on the project. We took dinner and lunch with him on several occasions. I was sometimes sitting next to my dad drinking a grape soda while they were having their Jack Daniels or their martinis and talking about different aspects of the project. And I was present at a lecture or sort of a meet and greet, as Secretary Rumsfeld described it, that he gave at an underground amphitheater at the Cerrillos Cultural Center in April of 1971, where he thanked us for our participation in the project, told us how proud our country and our families were that we were serving the security interests of our nation in the way that we were, and admonishing us to maintain absolute project secrecy. And it was during that meeting that he really articulated for me how teleportation was viewed by the U.S. Defense Department, and really this matter has given rise to my Truth campaign. He stated at that April 1971 seminar that the principal function or purpose of teleportation is military. It will allow the U.S. Army to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield. And so from the point of view of Donald Rumsfeld and the other individuals on the project, the significance of teleportation was primarily one of military strategy. It was a technology that had been weaponized as a result of the War Department, which of course became the Defense Department, seizing Nikola Tesla's technologies in 1943. And so I'm speaking out because I believe that that was an historical disaster. We could have prevented billions of tons of pollutants from entering our global atmosphere and endangering us with at least the prospect of climate change if we had made the transition to teleportation in the 1970s after its emergence, after its reduction to practice by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that was administering Project Pegasus. So I'm also going to be calling on Secretary Rumsfeld to really rise to the full level of public service. And that would be to recognize that we should now broaden the application of this technology so that the next generation of Americans and citizens of the world can reach their destinations on the surface of our planet in seconds rather than in hours, saving the environmental impacts of conventional transport. So those are the two major political figures who served on Project Pegasus. There are a number of individuals who served in different capacities at the CIA or DARPA or LANL who I've spoken to, and I'm going to be describing what they said to me during my investigation. I had a number of admissions by individuals I'm going to be able to name and describe what they did in the project who did confirm that Project Pegasus existed, that its thrust was time travel technologies, and that I was a child participant in it. So I'm going to be naming those names in my book. Before then, I'm going to be putting them up at my website, which is www.projectpegasus.net, which is a portal to keep abreast of my Truth campaign and also start providing information about the people, the places, the technologies, the experiences that I had on Project Pegasus.
Andy, without their backing, where are you in this whole thing?
Without whose backing?
Without the backing of maybe Rumsfeld and others. If nobody comes out with you, I mean, do you still feel confident that you can get this thing done?
Well, I was in a very tricky spot epistemologically. You know, epistemology is what? The study of the theory of knowledge. I had been in a secret project as a child, as a non-physicist, and I revisited my memories of my experiences in applied quantum physics, basically in time travel, from the perspective of an adult who was investigating what happened. Even if I had filed Freedom of Information Act requests into the project or under my name or under Project Pegasus, as a result of the national security exception to FOIA, I was not going to be shaking loose facts from the government. So certainly, one of the reasons I'm going to be making the call to Rumsfeld and Richardson to speak out is that I believe that they need to evince that standard of public service and of personal courage to help save our civilization. We simply can't go on within the context of our current technical infrastructure and deal with the population we're going to be seeing. I mean, I saw one study that suggested that if the Chinese went to 2 cars per household, which is the American average, we might have coastal flooding around the planet. So we're clearly going to have to develop a new technical infrastructure, and I believe teleportation is going to be a major part of that. Now, if they step forward, that's going to make international news. Let's say they don't answer my call to step forward, and I'm still out in the wilderness describing what happened to me. Well, I decided on a particular technique, which is to write a book that is so full of the facts that happened, and I've spent so many years fine-tuning a precise expression of exactly what I know, exactly what I remember, that is so concrete and specific and yet contains such an abundance of evidence that that in itself is going to create a testament to what happened, to the truth of what happened. So that at least I can say, well, you don't believe me? It's all in my book. Okay, I put down what I experienced and what I know about what I experienced. So tell me, read the book and then tell me, do you think that I'm a genius of creative writing, or am I somebody narrating things that actually happened to them? I find when people write me after I appear on radio, for example, or give a public talk, that when people do write, they either write basically to just blatantly insult me, which is kind of almost like a retaliation for telling an unusual story, or they really write to affirm the fact that they utterly believe what I'm describing. I've been told by many people that there's not only the ring of truth in my facts, because they're so well researched, but also in my voice. So I decided a number of years ago to primarily rest my truth campaign on the power of telling a story, which is really a primal human thing. At some point, teleportation is going to be declassified by the U.S. government and implemented. And at this point, because I'm only one of the few people who stepped forward to describe what the U.S. government has achieved in this area, what I can do right now is tell what happened to me with as much detail and as much specificity as possible. Certainly the FOIA requests are going to be made, but I decided to capture the story, to go back and revisit my memories and write down what happened and distribute outlines of that before approaching the government under the Freedom of Information, because I feared that if I approached the government first, I might put myself at physical jeopardy. In fact, I had a meeting with a representative of the executive branch of the Bush administration, namely the Executive Office of the President, in June of 2003, during that same fact-finding trip when I spoke with Governor Richardson. And I was essentially advised by the Bush administration that if I didn't stop investigating, writing about, and talking about the technologies that made up Project Pegasus, which remained sensitive, compartmentalized national security secrets, that they couldn't guarantee my survival. So I don't know whether they were threatening me or whether they were advising me that harm might come from another direction, perhaps from the Navy or a foreign government. But I was admonished by the Bush administration basically to terminate my investigation back in 2003. I agreed to do so while quietly continuing my investigation because I believed I was under an historical duty to describe what happened and share this information with the public. So if the adults who were involved at that time continue to cling greedily to life and to their conventional reputations rather than step forward and tell the truth about this project, all I can continue to do is describe what happened, answer people's questions about the technologies, consult with current technologists about how the technologies worked, continue to revisit my memories, continue to research things I have remembered. I mean, I've gone into the historical archives regarding specific individuals, let's say like Dr. Agnew at the Los Alamos Labs, and recovered information of an extrinsic nature that then corroborates my memories. That's happened numerous times during my investigation. So to answer your question, I'm going to be basing my truth campaign, I am basing my truth campaign primarily on the power of the information itself, but I'm confident that ultimately this program will be disclosed and will have a declassification of teleportation, and I hope to be there to cut the ribbon at the teleport at Grand Central Station in New York City.
Okay, now, if, say, some of these others don't come forward, would you have some kind of proof that you can slap down on them and say, well, here's proof that you were there?
Well, the truth is of an informational nature. I mean, I did recover an artifact of a toy that I left at one of the project locations, but that's just essentially a small child's toy that was baking in the New Mexico sun for 34 years. I've got insider information about the people involved. So, for example, in the same way that Stanton Friedman proved that President Eisenhower may very well have been diverted from a golfing trip into a meeting with extraterrestrials, I'm going to be able to identify where particular individuals were at a particular time. For example, when Donald Rumsfeld was secretly serving as the defense attaché to Project Pegasus, literally the point man to the Pentagon for the program, he was officially serving as a member of President Nixon's Board of Wage and Price Stabilization. So by providing information about the project participants, I'm going to be able to allow later researchers to begin digging into their activities. I'm also making historical connections in the area of the history of science. For example, in the Montauk Project accounts, the mathematician John von Neumann, who actually died in the mid-1950s, is described as sort of the mastermind of American time travel. That's not the case. In fact, the principal scientist who was linked to the emergence, and actually the practical emergence of both teleportation and chronovision, was the Italian nuclear physicist Enrico Fermi. He not only partnered with Father Ernetti and Father Gemelli when they first discovered chronovision in the 1940s while working at the Catholic University of Milan, but Enrico Fermi was the mentor of Dr. Harold Agnew, who then became the Federal Science Administrator of Project Pegasus. So I'm going to be able to make connections like that in the history of science that previously have not been made, but that may, for example, lead to the discovery of some of this information in historical archives that have been kept around the lives and works and correspondence and so forth of particular scientists. I believe that my growing public profile in this area will probably cause some of the other children to step forward. So I eagerly await the day when some do, and I have what I imagine will be pretty emotional reunions with some of the other children. I also am going to be articulating and am articulating the structure and function of some of the devices, and I'm already in communication with different people who are researching time travel who have affirmed that I have to be telling the truth. Let me explain that. Clearly, often it's said, well, if you can't provide me an historical document, then you can't prove what you're saying. But in fact, historical documents can be faked. But something of an applied scientific nature that somebody discusses can then be verified based on what they're describing as a function of science or technology. Let me cite one example. Since the beginning of my public campaign to bring about the truth regarding Project Pegasus and the fact that the U.S. government has had operational teleportation and chronovision now for 40 years, I said from the very beginning that the crystal array in the chronovisor was made from the element bismuth, which is element 83. I was recently contacted by a young man who, in fact, I was introduced to in adolescence. His father worked at Lockheed and was an associate of my father's when my father was working at Parsons. And they had actually introduced us during a summer camping trip in the Mount Shasta area. And so after I appeared on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th of last year, I received a telephone call from a young man by the name of Brett Stillings. And he said, Andy, I heard you on Coast, and I just want to say that I met you. I remember when we were teenagers how our fathers threw us together at this campground around Mount Shasta. And he then described what we were discussing during those several days where we were sharing adjacent campsites. And he said, Andy, I know you're telling the truth because of what you said about bismuth. The atomic structure of bismuth allows for lensing, allows for information from other dimensions to actually be lensed through the crystal array. And I said, well, what my dad was saying with the chronovision is that they were sending an electric magnetic signal through the bismuth crystals, and that led to the propagation of the hologram that then was lensing scenes of past and future events into the laboratory. So I've had encounters with people who are researching time travel presently who have said, look, especially because you're not a physicist, you have to be telling the truth, because there's no way that a layperson or even most physicists would have a clue that there are special properties to bismuth that would allow for the kind of lensing effect that you've been talking about. So I think the point of that story is that there are inherent proofs internally in my account that I will be describing in my book and that I can now share with others that reveal that I am telling the truth. In fact, I'm just sticking to the facts that I know. When I'm asked specific questions about something in physics that I don't understand or what have you, I'm saying that. I really can't answer that question. So I'm simply sharing what I know, what I remember happened to me, and then what I learned during my investigation of what happened to me. And then as a result of this, individuals are beginning to approach me who have insight into time travel technologies and are simply saying, look, you must be telling the truth, because there's no way that a layperson would even have a clue that bismuth has those kinds of characteristics.
Okay, in a second I want to ask you if you can explain a little more about the technology that created the vortex and such. But if you don't mind, Andy, I'd like to go to the phone lines. Somebody's been actually waiting around to ask a question. So, okay, Thomas from Texas, you are on Late Night in the Midlands.
Am I on?
Yes, sir, you are.
Oh my God, I'm on the air. I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Basiago for coming on and talking about what he does. I recently had Laura Eisenhower on my show a couple of weeks ago, and she had mentioned your name, and I was wondering if there was anything you could say about her and her experiences.
Well, yeah, it's just as a matter of personal courtesy. My name is pronounced Basiago, but I realize it's difficult, just for the record. But yes, thank you for affirming my work, my truth campaign. Well, I know Laura personally. She was introduced to me by Alfred Lambermont Weber, who's a friend of mine of many years of good standing. And Alfred is the chairman of the Mars Anomaly Research Society, which I'm quite proud that he accepted that post and has been really a key strategic ally of mine, both in sharing my Mars findings publicly and also describing my experiences in Project Pegasus publicly. Laura Magdalene Eisenhower is the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower. We've affirmed that. We've inspected her documents. We took a look at her passport and her driver's license just to establish that she's using that name, and then researched through the Eisenhower family, and her mother affirmed that Laura is her daughter. So the false statements that are being made that she's somebody who's falsely alleging that she's an Eisenhower need to stop, because she's not only an Eisenhower, but I think she's really to be commended for really is one of very few members of presidential families who have had the courage to step forward and involve themselves in the political realm, and indeed do so in a controversial way. I think the only descendant of an American president that I can think has done this was probably Amy Carter, when she took the courageous stand that she did against apartheid in South Africa. But Laura is who she says she is. She's a brilliant young woman, a polymath, an incredibly talented individual. And in 2006, she was approached to join the secret Mars colony that has been operational now for over 30 years. And in fact, she wasn't just approached, she was sort of manipulated in an infiltration of her personal life by somebody posing as somebody who wanted to get involved as her boyfriend, who then began manipulating her and essentially attempting to pressure her to pull up stakes here on this planet and join the colony that has been put on place on Mars for the last number of decades. And so I know her personally. I participated recently in a joint interview that was on March 28th on Exopolitics Radio out of Vancouver, BC. And I think she has a lot to offer. I believe that Laura is going to become a major figure in the disclosure movement because she has had the humanity and the courage to risk her reputation as a member of an American presidential family to share.
And I do have her scheduled. I'm sorry, I do have her scheduled for next week as well. And I have had Alfred on as well. So yeah, I've been getting into this pretty thick. So I appreciate everything that you're doing, Andy.
Well, thank you. When I was interviewed with Laura Eisenhower and Alfred's show, I was actually getting very moved emotionally because among people in the future that I would be implicated with publicly, that the program shared with me either intentionally or unintentionally, two of the names that I was able to remember and bring forward into the future were Alfred Lambermont Weber and Laura Eisenhower. And so that March 28th interview with Alfred was really just very emotionally moving for me because of that fact, because I thanked them at the beginning of the interview for showing up, because their identities had been shared with me when I was a child on Project Pegasus, and I think that fact in itself establishes that history will record that Alfred Weber and Laura Eisenhower are destined for even greater work as leaders of the disclosure movement. I've compared the disclosure movement to the abolition movement. The abolition movement, of course, freed us from physical slavery, freed a class of human beings from physical slavery. In a similar way, I believe the disclosure movement, the truth movement, is going to have a profound historical impact because it's going to liberate us from metaphysical slavery. And by that, I mean the oppression of having the true natural history of our solar system and its inhabitants and the true technical history of our civilization concealed from our awareness by government. It's going to end secrecy, and that's going to be a liberating development in the history of human civilization. So I'm very encouraged that Laura and Alfred and I, all of whom have had social disruption campaigns and even different forms of targeting directed at us during the last several decades, stood our ground and survived to tell what we know, and now are collaborating with each other in the disclosure movement. And so she is who she says she is. She's telling the truth. She's sharp as a tack, and I think she has much to offer. And it's just really my privilege to be her friend and ally.
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Thomas. I appreciate you calling in. And again, thank you, Andy. And we're going to get to Glenn in just a second. But yeah, if you want to talk a little more about the technology, what it looked like. And
yeah, the teleporter was clearly based on the fact that space is dense. There are more ergs of energy in a cubic meter of space than there are granules of sand on the planet. It's just an immense number. So one of the things we have to remember is that while space seems to be a void, it is incredibly dense with energy. Essentially, everything is made up of energy. And so what Tesla discovered is that permeating what Dr. Mark Cummings calls the quantum plenum is a form of energy that is pervasive and latent in the universe, which Tesla called radiant energy. And this was not the ball lightning and other electrostatic forms of energy that Tesla would play around with in his laboratory, throw a ball of lightning at Mark Twain when he was visiting his apartment in Manhattan or what have you. Radiant energy is something that Nikola Tesla began experimenting with in 1899 at Colorado Springs, Colorado. Tesla's initial work with teleportation began when he was experimenting at Colorado Springs at magnetizing cylinders, and he was doing things like dropping a penny or some other small object through the cylinder and finding that magnetism had certain effects that would cause the object to appear too quickly at the other end of the cylinder, or more slowly, or disappear altogether. My father was conducting similar experiments at the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratories in West Orange, New Jersey, between 1956 and 64. In fact, after one of my recent radio interviews, somebody who grew up in New Jersey during those years contacted me and said, "You're not going to believe this, but I heard you say that your father was doing things like dropping pennies through magnetized cylinders where he was trying to achieve teleportation effects at the Edison labs when he was working there between 1956 and 64. Well, when I was growing up in West Orange in 1956, I found a 1958 penny. And we took it to my friend's father, who worked at Bell Labs, and he became distressed by the existence of this 1958 penny and took it from me, and it was never returned to me. But of course, after 1958 and the minting of those pennies, it was indistinguishable as a 1958 penny. But for those 2 years before 1958, this individual, who was growing up in New Jersey in the same historical time and place that I was, although I came along in the 60s, was really affirming for me what I had alleged about my dad's work at the Edison labs. Here he was holding a time travel artifact from the future for 2 years, growing up in West Orange. And so I think that the thing to understand about the teleporter is that it wasn't a device that then imposed a condition on the universe. It was a device that harnessed a form of energy that Tesla discovered that's pervasive in the universe, and that when you draw this energy into our dimension, it creates a disequilibrium between the physical universe we're existing in and then the quantum plenum, which includes all timelines. And so it cuts through our dimension and allows somebody to essentially pass through the quantum plenum and be situated on another timeline. I'm not a physicist, so that's the best effort I can make at describing how it worked. An analogy in the physical realm would be when a child blows a bubble out of soap, they can put their hand inside a bubble, or they can wrap it around a butterfly or whatever, or put something in the bubble, and in that way they've extruded an envelope into the dimensionality of that time-space that includes the butterfly or their hand or whatever. In a similar way, the teleport had an effect like that, not just on the physical dimension that we live in, but on the entire time-space continuum itself, on a fourth dimensional basis. The technology that underlay the chronovisors is a little bit better understood by me. Essentially, it relied on a fundamental quantum truth that was articulated by Sir Isaac Newton, of all people, when he framed what is called Newton's inverse square law. Basically, Newton's inverse square law states that the intensity of the signal of a past event diminishes as the reciprocal of the square of the distance, which basically means that at 2 removes from the event, the signal fades to 1/4 of the original intensity, and then at 3 removes, 1/9 of the original intensity, and so forth. That's the fundamental law of Newtonian physics that causes the Doppler effect, right? When we're standing on the train station, we hear the train coming, and then it gets very loud when the event is occurring near us, and then gets quieter and quieter very quickly, kind of in a bell curve of sound. Well, if you think of that sound of the train then fading into the distance, our mind at a certain point no longer hears the train because we can no longer capture the signal of that event. In fact, our mind can no longer see the train nor hear it because both the light and sound signal can no longer be perceived by our eyes and our ears. But if you think of the fact that Newton's inverse square law indicates that the signal of that event, which is how we perceive the event itself, we only apprehend the signal. We don't perceive the event. We just perceive its manifestations in the physical universe. That event continues to fade asymptotically. In other words, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It gets 1/4 as intense, and then 1/9 as intense, and then 1/16 as intense, and then 1/25 as intense, as it gets 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 times more distant from us. But if you think of the logical implications of that in its mathematical expression, even a concept as fundamentally rudimentary to Newtonian physics and mathematics as Newton's inverse square law shows us how the universe permits chronovision, which is to say that an event never peters out. It diminishes, but it never becomes extinct. It retreats what we call asymptotically. It gets closer to non-existence, or the null state. It gets farther and farther away from our perception and our comprehension of our location in the time-space continuum. But no event that ever manifests in the time-space continuum is ever lost. In fact, Father Ernetti, who was one of the two developers of the chronovisor with Father Gemelli, once stated that every human being from birth to death traces an arc of light and sound in the quantum hologram. And so what the chronovisor was doing was simply tuning in past events, just as a radio station tunes in a radio signal. The bismuth crystal array, which was an octagonal array of polished bismuth crystals, that was an extrapolation of what Ernetti and Gemelli had hobbled together in their laboratory at the Catholic University of Milan when they were trying to develop a device that would allow them to split the signals of the harmonic patterns in Gregorian chants, had been developed by Bell Labs and other American companies, so that 20 years after Ernetti and Gemelli had a flat screen in which you could tune in a past event, Project Pegasus 20 years later had already modeled that into a three-dimensional hologram of a past event in the chronovisor. So all that the chronovisor was doing was lensing the signal of a past or future event, amplifying it electromagnetically, and then broadcasting it in our environment so that we could perceive it. But I was just thinking about, I was discussing this with one of my friends here in Vancouver, Washington, my good friend Michael Petrovich, who's a scientist and a mathematician. And we realized that Newton's inverse square law actually proves the feasibility of chronovision. I had been discounting it. I had been saying, you know, the post-Einsteinian physics will refute some of Newton's basic framing of the laws of the physical universe. But in fact, that particular principle actually explains how chronovision is even possible. It's possible because no event ever fades into oblivion. All events persist. The reason they become smaller and smaller is because of their distance from us in time and space. So the significance of that is that that moment when you were standing on that train station and waiting for the train and then hearing the train arriving and then having the train move swiftly by you and then diminishing as it left the train station always exists somewhere in the time-space continuum. The question is, do you have the technology or are you undergoing the spiritual experience to access where that event is still going on? And so the key is we live in a multidimensional universe, a universe of multiple adjacent, similar but slightly discrepant timelines where everything that has gone on, is going on, or will ever go on is going on simultaneously, just at different locations within that fifth dimensional matrix. My own particular religious belief or bias is that these events are being imagined by a supreme being. And so in the superintelligence of the Creator are a set of timelines where the Creator is imagining different versions of the same event simultaneously, and those events are ordered on separate timelines that are adjacent to each other. And I was thinking in terms of the operation of the physical universe, that might be necessary for events to be permittive at all. Because if you didn't have other events going on adjacent to those timelines, you might have one linear timeline that would collapse through a cosmic void forever. So the chronovisor is basically working by creating an electro-optical basis simply to find a signal of a distant event, amplify it, and then broadcast it in the laboratory.
Andy, for not being a physicist, you explained that very well. And I want to go ahead and take another call. Thank you. Okay, Glenn, I know you've been waiting, so you are on Late Night in the Midlands, my friend.
Hi, Andy. I just wanted to really thank you for coming forward about this technology. I know it takes a lot of courage, and it's from great men like you that things are going to change for the better in this world, and that's why me and Michael do what we do, and we try to get the word out. And boy, I have so many questions, but I know other people want to get in here, so I'm just going to maybe ask you a couple. What can you tell us maybe about expanding on your trip to Mars through the jump gate or whatever, and what anything you can say about Mars, maybe its environment, and also, do we have as many whistleblowers are also stating superluminal starcraft or spaceships, I guess? And is that how they got the Stargate to Mars, so that you could teleport to Mars? Did we have to go there in a ship first, or anything you can tell me about that would be awesome.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm really touched by what you said. I really feel it was a cosmic privilege to serve in Project Pegasus, and also, I really do view it as a cosmic privilege to share what happened with others. I'm really touched by what you had to say. I did go to Mars twice briefly in the summer of 1981. I can confirm the existence of the jump rooms that David Wilcock and Arthur Neumann and other brilliant people who are discussing these technologies have described. They do exist. The particular jump room that I used or was provided to get to Mars was located at a CIA facility in El Segundo, California. It was literally the elevator that we used to get up to the 5th floor of that building, which was a building over near that aerospace complex right at the, let me get my bearings right here, right at the northeast corner of El Segundo, where you've got Grumman and Hughes aircraft, and there's a cluster of buildings there with advanced satellite antenna array on their roofs and so forth. So I basically went up to the 5th floor of that building with the CIA contact officer that they'd put in my life, actually beginning that summer of 1981, Courtney M. Hunt, who was a cousin of the Hunt family of Texas and of E. Howard Hunt of Watergate fame, of all people. And we checked in there at the 5th floor. There was a single person working at the counter of what in the legal profession we call a Fijian suite. It was basically a big counter that served multiple offices on that floor. And we simply checked in and provided my name, and then I asked Courtney Hunt, where's the teleport? I mean, I don't see any armatures of the device, because the only teleports I had encountered in childhood were the Tesla energetic arrays at Curtiss-Wright and Sandia, and then the much larger sort of gate-shaped Stargate device at the Cerritos Cultural Center. And he said, Andy, we just came up here on it. It's the elevator. I said, you're kidding me. And he says, no. So you have to get back in the elevator. So I walked in the elevator. It went up to about the 8th floor, the top of the building. And they were just having me linger there. I guess maybe they were testing my bio responses to stress or whatever at that point. And I actually got impatient to get to Mars. I mean, I was really apprehensive about going. And I finally borrowed a phrase from the space program. I said, light this candle. And Courtney Hunt laughed ruefully in the manner of career CIA people. He was the classic cigarette-smoking man from the company, as it were. And the trip to Mars took about 20 minutes. About halfway through, about 10 minutes into the journey, the rectangular shape or box-like shape of the elevator began to morph into a cylindrical shape. And so I actually had to adjust my posture as if ultimately I was sort of leaning inside of a big water main, a cylindrical pipe. And the ceiling, I could see this swirling kind of wormholing effect as the jump room actually morphed into a cylindrical shape. And during that period, there was intense pressure. At one point in the 80s, I had been taking scuba lessons, and I estimated for Dr. Brooks Agnew that it was about as much pressure that you experience at 40 feet below sea level, 40 feet under the surface of the ocean when you're scuba diving, which is 2 atmospheres. So there was a substantial amount of pressure on my ears and head and body and so forth when the jump room began morphing. But after a few minutes of that, the pressure abated and the jump room just remorphed back into its original shape. So somewhere here between 1971, let's say, and 1981, which was the time between when we were teleporting through vortal tunnels in time-space in Project Pegasus, and then when I took those 2 short trips to Mars in 1981, the U.S. government had developed some kind of cutting-edge technology or material that could actually stay around you as you were teleporting. Then, as Courtney Hunt had described, the door opened. I found myself in an underground location on Mars, and as instructed, I walked up the staircase there and out behind the eyes of a skull on the surface of Mars. Mars is dotted with large skulls and other statues that indicate to humanoids on the surface of Mars that there's an access point to the primarily underground location on Mars. So I walked through the eye sockets, behind the eye sockets of this strange skull-like construction on the surface, and really just stepped out of the eye socket, and this young human being from Earth bounded up and greeted me. I had, during that first jump, a protective helmet on and a rudimentary respiration device kind of laid over my shoulders. And he was laughing at me because I kept on yelling, "Can I take off my helmet?" I never liked wearing helmets. We wore them several times in Project Pegasus on particular chronovisor experiences when they were involving a high amount of energy. But I always felt kind of confined in helmets, and I was yelling, "Can I take off my helmet?" And he laughed, and I took off my helmet. And that allowed me to sense even more clearly the environment of Mars, which I think is your second question. I would estimate that it was about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Initially, when I took off my helmet and hence lost the respiration capacity that the helmet had, I sensed that Mars has less oxygen than Earth, so I found myself breathing in kind of a labored way. It reminded me of the kind of respiration you do after you've been swimming all day on a hot, smoggy day in Los Angeles, and you have what Angelenos call smog lung. You have kind of a mild, transient sensation of asthma, and you feel like you're not getting as much oxygen as you were earlier in the day with each breath. So the air there is breathable by human beings from Earth, but simply has less oxygen. It's primarily a desert landscape. If there's a location on Earth that I've visited that comes most closely to the landscape of Mars, I would have to say it's probably Sedona, Arizona. Most of the dirt is that distinctive rust red that you find around Sedona, although there are patches of kind of caramel-colored brown and ochre kind of yellow and different sort of mineral deposits. There are turquoise rocks litter the surface that are very beautiful, these turquoise-colored. In fact, it's those turquoise colors, that brown, drab green, caramel-colored tan, ochre, and light turquoise blue, and even darker turquoise blue, that we find in the Egyptian artifacts from the high Egyptian civilization that reached Mars during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who of course was the husband of Queen Nefertiti. So the Martian atmosphere is breathable. The environment is very much like hiking in the desert. During the second jump up there with Courtney Hunt a month later in August of '81, we walked around for about 3 or 4 hours just to give me a better acclimation to the surface of Mars. And even though I was lighter on my feet because of the lower gravity on Mars and didn't have to struggle to take each step the way you do on Earth, and I kind of felt some sense of lightheadedness from that, or just actual lightness, nonetheless, I got really severe cramping in my thigh muscles, and I think that was probably because we were walking for a number of hours, and there was less oxygen available to me while I was exercising. So I think I was actually developing hypoxia in the tissues of my muscles as a result of the oxygen demand that my muscles were placing on my body, and I really wasn't getting enough oxygen. So Mars may not be a place that's habitable by all humans. I certainly also became very dehydrated, and we did not bring any provisions of food or water, and I didn't consume any water or food when I was up there on either trip. So I was severely dehydrated when I returned to El Segundo, especially after that second trip. I don't believe that we needed to develop StarCraft to get to Mars. We do have a space fleet, and of course we have teleportation technology, not just in some of our space planes, but even our planes that are flying in the atmosphere. For example, Bob Beckwith, who was a consulting engineer for Project Pegasus, was interviewed by myself, Ken Thomas of Steam Shovel Press, and the author Alexandra Bruce. There were 4 separate interviews, one by Ken, one by Chica, and then I did 2 separate interviews of Bob Beckwith, who I remembered as having not only met when I was on Project Pegasus, but my father and another Parsons engineer and Bob walked around the Bandelier National Monument together one day as an outing when I was on Project Pegasus. And during our interviews with Bob Beckwith, he was then in his 80s, he acknowledged that the teleportation capability was placed on the stealth bombers. Now, if you remember, the cost of the F-14 and F-15 Phantom strategic bombers went from, what was it, $100 million per F-14 and F-15 to $1 billion with the development of each B-1 and B-2 stealth bombers. Right. And I allege the reason for that was not just the development costs of the stealth, but the fact that nothing on the stealth can be metallic, or at least conductive, because the pilots of the stealth bombers can turn on a teleportation capability and not just fly to their destination, but teleport there. So we have placed teleportation technology in our near-Earth environment and in the atmosphere around Earth. Of course, the significance of the Gary McKinnon case, where this young man in the United Kingdom, now it looks like he's going to be have to come to this country and face the U.S. justice system for breaking into the defense community's, the American defense community's secret databases online. He's not being prosecuted or won't be prosecuted for doing that. I think the significance of Gary McKinnon is that he proved the existence of a secret space program. And actually, the father of the International Space Station, who's writing under the pen name Millennium Twain, has also been corresponding with Laura and I about the fact that we have a fleet of about 200 space planes that are far more advanced than the space shuttle, and that the space shuttle is just a program for public consumption. And we can actually do a horizontal takeoff from Earth and get into space with space planes. Were those starcraft needed to get to Mars? I don't have the information from that interregnum between Project Pegasus and my two brief trips to Mars in the early 80s, but I think the answer is probably no, because they were developing the capability to know where they were going to be putting somebody down and in what time-space reference, and that was pretty much operational before I left Project Pegasus as an 11-year-old. For example, when we first started teleporting to Santa Fe in the summer of 1970, sometimes we would pop into view wherever around Santa Fe, greater Santa Fe. And it was for that reason that we actually had to memorize the street map of Santa Fe to be able to get to the collection area, which was the Baton Memorial Building, actually in the state capitol complex there. But by 1972-73 time frame, they were quite expert at getting us to a specific location. And so I think it was as a result of that capability that they were able to pinpoint a location on Mars and teleport some kind of paraphysical object there, namely the jump room, by the early 1980s. Now, the term Stargate, which of course is conspicuous because it became one of the words used in the title of Stargate Atlantis, whose first episode, by the way, was entitled Project Pegasus, and one of the most egregious acts of disinformation that the U.S. government has ever perpetrated. That was a term that was used in the late 60s and early 1970s regarding the advanced teleportation units that were being used to get us to the far future. We made several trips to the year 2045 to enter an office building where project members were giving us microfilm summaries of intervening events between the early 1970s and the 2040s that project historians were writing, so that the present could be briefed regarding what the next 70 years held. So Stargates were in existence by 1971-72, and I'm sure that the mastery of those in the time-space context on Earth also enabled us to get to Mars with such specificity in terms of time-space coordinates by the early 1980s.
Thank you, Andy.
Andy, oh yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to say, is this a U.S.-only program as far as you're aware, or were there any other governments that were kind of acting in cooperation?
Oh, I'd have to say that all of my experiences in applied quantum physics for the U.S. government have been held under a regime of utmost secrecy by super patriots within the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, DARPA, the Los Alamos National Laboratories, and the U.S. Navy, and involved agencies like that. You know, you just look at the people involved. I mean, the physicists in Los Alamos, a number of them had been principals in the Manhattan Project, like Dr. Agnew, like Dr. Edward Teller. One of the individuals involved went on to a stellar career in America as an American astrophysicist. That's Dr. Sterling Colgate. Many of the project engineers, like my father, as a result of their connections to the Central Intelligence Agency, actually were shadow listed as officers in either the United States Navy or Army. All of the companies involved were leading U.S. defense contractors. The laboratories were our leading weapons labs. I mean, I'm speaking out because, look, time travel was weaponized at its birth, and that's really the historical tragedy that I'm trying to reverse. So I would say, to a 99.9% certainty, and certainly based on all of my experiences, both as a child in Project Pegasus in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but also then teleporting to Mars for a few brief trips in the early 80s, that this was an American enterprise. And I think that's another reason why we should now declassify this. The world needs to know that the greatest government, the greatest people in the history of human civilization created the time-space age in the same way that they established constitutional republican government and the same way that they advanced the scientific revolution in the 20th century to enable us to take care of everybody on the planet. And so I really think we need to take the historical credit for what we achieved as a great American civilization. And that's why I think it's not just my ethical duty, but my patriotic duty to speak out and say, you know, this was really a great accomplishment of our uniquely American civilization, a civilization that I think should be emulated by other governments and countries around the world. And let me just also add on a personal note that when my father sat me down in the late 1980s and asked me to tell the truth about what happened, you know, after he was long dead and gone and there couldn't be retaliation against our family, for me speaking out, because I didn't sign, well, I did sign a secrecy oath, but I did so as an 8-year-old. So I can't be held to the secrecy oath that I signed, which was on Department of Defense letterhead. But I said, Dad, why after all these years are you now urging me to speak out about what we were part of? And he said, son, because we were part of something great. And he recognized that this was just like the development of air flight, the development of time travel was a fundamental contribution to human civilization that was made by the people of the United States of America. And that's one of the major reasons why I believe the story of Project Pegasus now needs to be told.
Well, I'll let somebody else get on. I just wanted to thank you again, and, you know, hopefully one of these days, you know, we'll wake up the people and we can get this free energy technology out there so we can, you know, stop going into countries for oil supposedly and all that good stuff. And you guys have a great night. I'll be talking to you a little bit later, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, and I appreciate the great questions from you and looking forward to talking to you in just a little while. Okay, so Andy, one of the more incredible things about this story is the government identifies future American presidents and briefs them in advance. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yes, I have direct evidence and I have indirect evidence, both of a personal nature, about the fact that after the emergence of quantum access in the early 1970s, the ability to derive information from the past and future, that was achieved by DARPA under the aegis of Project Pegasus and then established a system of reporting about future events to the Central Intelligence Agency, that they had the identity of the following presidents, and I'll describe how I know that they had them. They had the identity of President Carter, both Presidents Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama. By the time that Project Pegasus ended, they were in possession of the actual identities of these particular future presidents. I don't have any data on President Ford or President Reagan because I simply didn't have a direct or secondhand experience with those names when I was either attached to Project Pegasus or later. Let me go through each of them historically here in seriatim to explain why and how I know this. Okay. In 1971, when I was in New Mexico as a result of teleporting there, I was frequently in the company of my father. I mean, he spent 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So when he died in 1990 at age 66, when one compared his birth certificate to the date on the prayer card that we distributed at his services, he was actually biologically 8 years older than that because he had spent 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So I spent a lot of time during my project experiences in New Mexico when he was virtually living there for long periods of time. And I spent 4 summers that were sandwiched in between the fall of 1969 and the summer of 1972, living there with my dad in New Mexico secretly. Now, during the summer of 1971, and by that I mean the first summer of 1971, because when that summer of 71 ended, I then teleported back to New Jersey, arriving on the day that I left, and re-experienced the summer of 1971 and had an entirely different set of experiences back on the original timeline. So when I say, in my public lectures about my experiences, I've been talking about this as the first summer of 1971 for me. There were 2. Okay, he came, we were having lunch with a longtime friend of his in Albuquerque named Mary Constance Chavez, also known as Connie Chavez or Pilly Chavez. She worked as the cashier and a sometimes waitress in the Mexican restaurants in Old Town Albuquerque that at that time, and even somewhat to this day, are considered the finest Mexican restaurants in all of New Mexico. And so Connie spent a lot of time with us when we were engaging in just downtime in Albuquerque. My dad left the lunch table, just Connie and I were there, and came back to the lunch table with a black leather security satchel. And he pulled out a book and began discussing the contents of the book with Connie. That book was the 2005 Universe Books edition of Alfred Lambermont Weber's book, Exopolitics, which I edited for Alfred, and I authored a 20-page appendix to that work that provides statements made by dozens of distinguished world citizens about the fact that our planet is being visited by extraterrestrials. And it was during that discussion that Connie turned to the front pages of Alfred's book, Exopolitics, and said to my father, "Who is President Jimmy Carter?" And my dad said, "He's currently serving as governor of Georgia." But to them, it was the name of an obscure, unknown American. And so what my dad was revealing, that when they would take one of these artifacts from the future, they would then begin investigating that person and identifying them as individuals with a particular destiny, which was to become someday president of the United States and leader of the free world. So I know that they had the identity of President Jimmy Carter. There was also a lunch in the 1971 time frame that I was at, that was at the La Hacienda restaurant, in which, as they sometimes did, they were bringing these future American political leaders through the social network of the project for the purpose of meeting them and having the distinguished scientists and engineers working for this very secret defense community project apprise them of what they had found. And so at one of those lunches, President George H.W. Bush, his wife Barbara, and his son George Walker Bush were present. I was about 9. I would say that George W. Bush was about, maybe 24, 25 years old. And it was at that lunch that George W. Bush was going to every table in that restaurant that had project people at it, and he was joking in an extremely garrulous, almost an out-of-control way. "Have you heard my daddy and I are going to be president?" In fact, he got right in my face.
Wow.
And I never forgot his face, because George W. Bush at 25 was the most energetic person that I have ever encountered. He was so electric with personal energy that he was almost out of control. He almost was coming off as a crazy person. But he kept on joking, "Have you heard my daddy and I are going to be president?" Of course, only one person can serve as president, so the joke was that they had just apparently been briefed, or had been briefed recently, that they both, as father and son, held the destiny of reaching that office. So that was direct evidence. I met George W. Bush when he was a young man, and what he said doesn't just create the rebuttable presumption. It's evidence that he had been briefed on his presidency. The Bill Clinton incident is a little bit more obscure. It's secondhand. What happened was, when we were jumping back and forth between the teleport at the Curtis Wright Building in Woodridge, New Jersey, and the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds, or when we were then being transported to Sandia and jumping back to the tarmac at Curtis Wright in New Jersey, sometimes the tunnel that the teleport opened up would begin collapsing and losing momentum, obviously in a superluminal way, but they were somehow able to measure the tunnel that had opened up. And when that happened, we would pop into view not in New Mexico or in New Jersey, but in a grassy area near the Swagelok Company headquarters building in Solon, Ohio. Swagelok was a pressure pipe fitting company that had been founded by a man by the name of Fred Lennon. And they did an extensive amount of contracting for the Defense Department because they provided basically hose couplings that allowed no leakage. They were precision pipe fitting parts. And so Fred Lennon had apparently been approached to place a teleport on the far right side of that sprawling one-story complex that Swagelok is headquartered in Solon. And so we would pop into view in this grassy field, and then I remember crossing a street and then walking behind the Swagelok building into the right side of the building there, and we would jump to New Mexico or New Jersey, whichever was our destination. And it was during one of those jumps with Connie. My dad invited Connie Chavez to experience what it was like to teleport. And I was walking in front of them through the parking lot there, in front of the entryway in the middle of the Swagelok headquarters building. And she said to my dad, and this is a direct quote, she said, "Ray, everybody on the project says that this young man named Bill Clinton is going to be one of our next future presidents. Tell me, is it true?" And my father said, "Yep, that's what they say." And so that showed that the project people had also identified the identity of William Jefferson Clinton as a future, one of our next future presidents. The final experience I had, which was not in the context of Project Pegasus, but which I attribute either to profound serendipity or maybe even divine providence, occurred when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. In 1982, I was talking to a white South African political activist on the UCLA campus. He was there to distribute pamphlets in support of the notion that the University of California should divest from South African corporations as a protest against apartheid and as a way of defunding the white apartheid-based regime of South Africa. And I began discussing different issues in political economy with him. And he said, "You know, I have a house guest right now. Like you, he's an undergraduate. He's studying at Columbia, but he's staying at my house for a few days. I'd like for you to go over to my apartment and meet this individual." And so he drove me in his Volkswagen Bug from the UCLA campus over to the house that he was renting, sort of a house apartment there. I believe it was either on San Vicente Boulevard or Bundy in West Los Angeles. It was in that area of West LA, certainly north of the Santa Monica Freeway, west of the UCLA campus. And I walked into the apartment or house, and quickly a tall, young African-American man my age entered from one of the adjacent rooms and introduced himself. And I asked him about his unusual name. I'm somewhat sensitive about that subject because I have a very difficult last name to pronounce, a very unusual name myself in that sense. And I said, "You know, Barack Obama, that's quite a name." And he said, "Yeah, it's an African name, man. My dad was Barack Obama Sr. He was from Kenya. I'm Barack Obama Jr. So I know it was President Obama." And he explained that he had just spent a year studying at Columbia, but he was in Los Angeles to quote-unquote hang out with his friends from Occidental College. You may remember that President Obama spent his first 2 years as an undergraduate at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, near Pasadena. Mm-hmm. And during that half hour or so, we discussed different issues in political economy, but primarily focusing on what role the transnational corporations would play in the future. And after about 20, 25 minutes, our debate in political science began to unravel into a heated argument. I was taking a much more radical socialist position that the corporations, should be made nonprofits and should be basically defanged, because if we didn't find a way to regulate the corporations as literally a fourth branch of government, we would find ourselves possibly losing Republican government to them, representative government to them, and they would possibly oppress or even destroy the world, which was certainly in line with contemporary thinking around that time in the nuclear freeze movement and so forth, that we had to restrain the role that the multinationals were playing because they weren't being governed. They were destroying the environment, lowering wages around the world, and potentially endangering even the survival of our global civilization. Barack Obama was taking much more of a doctrinaire, kind of Harvard liberal position that we need corporations because they distribute liability among individuals and allow for cooperative enterprise and so forth. So it became an argument. And our host, his house, the individual he was staying with there, said to me, "You better be nice to him, Andy, because he's going to be president of the United States one day." And I said something flippant like, "Oh, well, maybe we'll pitch against each other in the same game of a World Series." And he said, as Barack Obama then smiled at me and walked away, his friend said, "No," he turned to me, literally within about a foot away, and he said, "No, you don't understand, Andy. We know he's going to be president." And then I looked up at Barack Obama as he was walking up the staircase, and he looked over at me and stuck his chin in the air and kind of nodded his head with grim affirmation of what his friend had just said in our presence. So really my data is from two second-hand but two first-hand sources. I learned through a document that President Carter was destined to be president, by overhearing a conversation between project principals regarding President Clinton, because Connie was doing a lot for the project, and certainly my dad was one of the project principals. but I had direct encounters with President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama in which they revealed a consciousness that they had been at least briefed about the fact they were persons of interest because the government had detected the fact, based on quantum access, that they would someday serve as president. In a similar way, I have been approached several times during my life and apprised of the role that I would play in the future, not revealing what I know about Project Pegasus, but revealing what I'm discovering regarding life on Mars. And so piecing this together and trying to create a mosaic out of the puzzle pieces, I think the evidence creates, constitutes substantial evidence that quantum access has been used to identify and then brief future leaders, because if that isn't occurring, then how could President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama know this? They weren't just stating a confidence that they possessed the potential to reach the White House. They stated a consciousness regarding a future event that they knew they were implicated in, that they were destined to become president to a scientific certainty. And I think that shows what actually has been going on, which is that even though there was a reluctance to play God and alter the future based on quantum access to future information, this has been used to brief future presidents of their destiny. And because I think that departs from the constitutional model of selecting president, as a member of the Washington State Bar, who is literally a sworn constitutional officer, I believe that I'm under a professional and ethical duty to reveal this to the American people, that the way that they elect the president has been, if not undermined, at least complicated by this winner's advantage that individuals like Bush and Clinton and Obama of my generation have been given by knowing on the day that they announce their candidacy that they are the ultimate winner.
Okay, Glenn, I was wondering if possibly you would want to join us a little longer going into the third hour with myself and my co-host Glenn, and maybe we can open lines and take a few calls. And I had a few more questions for you. You're just a fascinating guest, and I'd really like to go a little further with you if you can.
Sure, I'm good to go for another hour or more. So
okay, that's great. So what I'll do in about 7 minutes, when this hour ends, we'll have to do, everybody on the phone lines, including you as well, Andy, we'll have to hang up and then call right back, and then we'll head into the next 2 hours. But what I want to ask you quick before we do end this this segment of the show, with your knowledge, is Obama really an American citizen? I mean, is he legit?
Well, you know, the first thing we talked about was his name, and I think what he said is telling. I was essentially teasing him a little bit and saying, you know, that's quite an exotic name, you know, for an African American. I really violated the Dale Carnegie principle that, you know, which states, I think it's in How to Win Friends and Influence People, that the sound of a man's name is the sweetest thing that he can hear. And I really violated. In fact, I joked with Barack Obama that I had done that. I kind of apologized to him. I said, geez, I don't mean to make fun of your name, but it is unusual. And he said, and I said, is it your real name? And he said, yeah. My dad was from Africa. He was a Barack Obama senior. He said, my dad was from Africa. He was born in Kenya. He was Barack Obama senior. I'm Barack Obama junior. Now, unless he was, because they didn't know who I was. I mean, they didn't know that I was destined to become a lawyer, a prominent public figure as a result of my Pegasus revelations and my Mars research. They just thought I was some UCLA undergrad who had some interesting ideas in political science that they wanted to talk about. And I don't think that they would have revealed to me that they knew he was destined to be president if they knew I had been a child participant in the very intelligence community program that had developed the technologies that gave the U.S. government the capability to know that a 20-year-old Barack Obama was destined to reach the White House and have, let's say, his mentor at Columbia, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had just served as National Security Advisor to President Carter, undoubtedly brief him during that first year at Columbia, or even possibly early. Maybe he was told by a CIA contact officer, such as they put in my life in 1981, that he was destined to be president. In fact, Courtney Hunt had urged me to transfer to Columbia. That's another sidebar of the story that I haven't discussed. I don't know how relevant it is. But Courtney Hunt, the CIA officer that they put in my life beginning in the summer of 1981, at the end of the summer of 1981, advised me to put in an intercampus transfer to Columbia, which would have sent me to Columbia the same year that Barack Obama left Occidental College in California to begin his third year of college at Columbia. So that's conspicuous in the extreme. Do I believe he's a natural-born American and hence that fits the constitutional test of that? I would say yes. I would say that based on my brief meeting with him when we were undergraduates, and he at Columbia and I at UCLA, that his spontaneous answers seemed to show a consciousness that his father had been born in Kenya and that he had not been, but that he bore the multinational legacy of his Kenyan ancestry in his name. And so I appreciate the courageous truth campaign that Philip Berg has been waging. I think that he bases it not so much on the notion of whether or not Barack Obama was born in Kenya versus Hawaii. If I'm not mistaken, Phil Berg, who's certainly a fellow lawyer that I greatly admire, I believe he bases his challenge to President Obama's nationality and hence his fitness to qualify for president based on the fact that his mother and he renounced their American citizenship when she married an Indonesian national and moved to Indonesia from Hawaii. That seems to be the way the Obama birth controversy has evolved. It's almost irrelevant that even if he was born in Hawaii as the Hawaiian newspapers memorialized, that he lost his citizenship when he became an Indonesian citizen and never regained it. And of course, it's been alleged that the reason that President Obama hasn't released his school records is not to hide his grades, but is to hide the fact that he attended American colleges and law school on a Fulbright scholarship, which certainly at the undergraduate level for individuals studying in the United States is only available to foreign nationals. I don't know. I think that during that meeting in 1982, he seemed to regard himself as an African American with an African-born father. As an attorney, I would emphasize something that has been kind of ignored, which is that a public record like that is an ancient document. It's certainly self-authenticating in the sense that the Honolulu Advertiser or some Hawaii newspaper shows that there was a birth announcement made in Hawaii. In the law, that sets up what we call a rebuttable presumption that he was born in Hawaii. So if his Kenyan grandmother says something else, what would be controlling under the American law of evidence would be that historical record contained in that ancient document. Clearly, Barack Obama and I are now 48. He was elected when he was, 46, 47? So that document had been in existence for almost 50 years and certainly meets the 20-year test for an ancient document. So I think that the preponderance of the evidence seems to establish that he was born in Hawaii. And I also might add that I don't have any umbrage against President Obama or any other American president. I think that individuals who serve as president have a degree of responsibility that most of us can't even understand. I remember that Harry Truman once stated that when he learned that President Franklin Roosevelt had died and that he would be sworn in as president, he felt not only that the weight of the entire world had been placed on his shoulders, but that it was actually crushing him and driving his feet into the ground. And so it must be a crushing responsibility to become aware as a young person that in many years hence you're going to be serving as chief executive. And I think that the individuals who have served during my life certainly have been individuals who have striven mightily to serve the country and the world well. And so I don't mean any particular criticism of both the Republican and the Democrats who have served as president. What I'm simply emphasizing is that, look, we all still understand that our leadership is emerging spontaneously and that through the exercise of the Article 2 provisions for selecting president, we are doing so. The problem is that technology that's in the possession of the U.S. intelligence community has outpaced those legal and social protocols for electing president, and I believe the American people, if they're to remain free and independent people, deserve to be told that. They deserve to know that the winners have this winner's advantage, that they've been not so much groomed from the presidency through the divine right of kings, but really informed of their destinies by an intelligence community that's operating at a greater degree of sophistication than the general public has been made aware.
Okay.